Emma Vigeland, Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Joining us now from Dakar, Senegal, writer and conflict analyst Hannah Rae Armstrong, who has is in the region, obviously, in the Sahel, and to talk to us about the coup in Niger. Hannah, welcome to the show. Can you give us just sort of like, you mentioned before we came on, and Emma and I were confessing our ignorance about that region of the world, and Niger in particular. And you said, it really only pops up in American news every 12 years or so. There's been a series of coups in this country. Will you give us a sense of just sort of like some of the at least relatively recent history, or maybe even going back to the mid 20th century?
Sure. I will try to sum up. So there's this thing emerging in the region known as the Sahel, which is being called a sort of coup belt or a coup corridor. And that's playing on the idea that the region known as the Central Sahel, which is composed of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which is sort of the nucleus of a big kind of global war on terror conflict pitting Western states against Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates. And so the trend for the past decade or so has been for Western forces to increasingly sort of invest in these countries and their fights against extremist insurgents. But as of 2 or 3 years ago, that trend has started to reverse as soldiers and military rulers have overthrown democratically elected, according to some, regimes in those countries. And so you had a series of coups in Mali and Burkina Faso, each of which has had 2 within the past couple of years. And the more coups sort of hit Mali and Burkina Faso, the more Niger stood apart as this sort of an exception, and was labeled as a sort of paragon of democracy in the region. The Western forces that were being displaced from Mali and Burkina Faso were increasingly moving into Niger to support Nigerian forces and to sort of carry on the same fight against extremist insurgent groups. And this put a lot of pressure on Niger. And ultimately, we had what happened a little over a week ago, which is the first sort of this round of coups has hit Niger.
We should just say that the Sahel runs from Eritrea all the way across the African continent to Senegal. And it basically parallels the equator. And is it considered a region because of how is it organized as a region? Like, why do is it just because of specifically like the climate and the terrain, or what is it that makes that a region? Because it's such an odd, to my eye anyways, it just seems to be an odd sort of configuration for a region.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very sort of nebulous concept. There isn't really an agreement on what the word Sahel really refers to. It has a kind of environmental and geographic definition, which has to do with how much grassland is present. It can be used to apply to areas as diverse as Eritrea to the east and Cape Verde to the west. But in recent years, it's really been kind of associated with a group of 5 countries that have been the sort of focal point of Western efforts to support counterterrorism in West Africa. And those 5 countries are the 3 I mentioned earlier: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, along with Chad and Mauritania.
You said that allegedly or so-called democratically elected in Burkina Faso, I guess, and in Niger. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on why so-called.
Yeah, well, I was specifically referring to Niger, but I mean it's apt for each of the countries. There's this sort of expectation that democratic elections and transitions can sort of take place, and there's a lot of support for these types of elections to take place. And the war on terror has kind of made it much more important for these types of transitions to take place and for elected leaders to be put into power for the purposes of sort of partnership. And this has led to a lot of sort of oversight and wishful thinking in terms of what these actual administrations are doing. And it's also led to there being a lot less accountable to their own populations and a lot more accountable to sort of foreign donors and military support. So in the case of Niger, for example, it's a really, it was touted as this sort of successful democratic transition, the first in the country's history. President Bazoum took over from his predecessor, who he was politically aligned with, and who he was basically chosen to handpick to succeed. And there were elections were held. There were irregularities. There were reports of fraud. The main opposition candidate was imprisoned on trumped-up charges. But in the end, the election was sort of seen as credible enough, given the needs of basically Western powers to continue working with the country. The bar was pretty low. So President Bazoum, in terms of how he came into power, it was sort of, it has been exaggerated, the extent to which he was, he could count as a credibly democratically elected leader, given how low the bar is. And since he came into power, he's actually done a pretty good job in certain areas. He kind of has a mixed track record. He has worked very hard to sort of cement partnerships with the United States and France. But he has also worked on security questions in the country and had some really positive results in certain areas. On the political front, he has sort of continued with his predecessor in terms of harassing and arresting journalists and bloggers who criticize or question some of his cabinet's moves, or who call for investigations into massive corruption scandals, and has done things like ban protests and sort of covered up or associated with really corrupt elites. So there's a really big sort of separation between how he's perceived on the outside and the types of rhetoric that we're hearing now from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken or from the French foreign minister, who are calling for his restoration as the representative of constitutional order, the guarantor of constitutional order, and how he's seen inside the country, which is much more nuanced and in many cases negative perception.
So just to catch people up, so Mamadou Issoufou, forgive me for mispronouncing all of these names. I can't pronounce much anyways. But he served 2 terms. There was a peaceful transition of power by someone with arguably democratically elected. There was nearly a coup, though, right on the eve of the election. Was that my understanding? And the essentially the head of the security forces that protected the previous president stayed on and was in many respects sort of like instrumental in this coup going forward. Do we get a sense of how much of the interest that the Western that the colonial powers, frankly, have in Niger is a function of stuff like uranium, which I think is the biggest export from Niger, and how much of it is a way of maintaining some type of control over ISIS aligned groups or Islamist aligned groups that might destabilize the whole region? Or am I saying the same thing when I say those 2 things, essentially? Is that the same sort of incentive structure?
I mean, there are certainly, material interests, in terms of mining interests. Arguably it gets a little bit exaggerated to what extent France still holds on to close ties in Niger as a function of its dependency on uranium which is mined in northern Niger, which happens to have a very refined source of yellow cake, which fuels much of the French power grid. In terms of, to what extent current policies are dictated by material interests like mining and extractive industry interests, or policy priorities like combating terrorism. I think it's helpful to sort of look at, if you sort of look at installations in the country, northern Niger is the site of French uranium mining, and it's also the site of a relatively recent American Air Force base, as well as what's been reported on as a sort of CIA drone base a little bit further north of that. So it's obviously a very strategic area, both for France and for the United States. France, could France do without Niger's uranium? More so than is generally being acknowledged at this point. But at the same time, there is an interest in sort of keeping it out of the hands of other actors. And there's also a sense that uranium prices fluctuating as they do, the territorial arrangements that France has in northern Niger could become a lot more valuable in coming years. So for instance, after the Fukushima disaster, the price of uranium plummeted, and it's sort of stayed pretty low since then. And France has actually kind of drawn down its uranium exploitation in northern Niger. But that doesn't mean that it's willing to sort of give up this territory, and things could change, and it could become a lot more valuable.
Speaking of that, I mean, that sort of dynamic of controlling the spigot of these things, we may not need the uranium, but we want to make sure maybe the Chinese or the Russians don't get a hold of it, and them, turning that into either using it themselves or providing it to other governments. What is their presence there? Let's start with Russia, because it does have a feel of like a potential where this region could become even more of a proxy type of conflict. It seems like, because as far as I've read, it sounds like Russia has condemned the coup, but the Wagner Group is there supporting the coup. Is that the case, or did I misread that, or what are we to make from that?
That's almost right. There is this kind of strange dissonance between what the Russian Foreign Ministry has said about the coup, which is, as you say, condemning it. Wagner isn't yet in Niger, to my knowledge, but it has been kind of credibly reported that the junta leaders have met with Wagner in neighboring Mali, following the playbook of Mali and Burkina Faso. Shortly after military rulers toppled the elected governments, they also opted to sort of swap out France as their primary security partner with Wagner. What's kind of an open question is to what extent Wagner and the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian state are aligned on this and working together on this. And it's not really clear yet what the answer to that is. But I think we can definitely see, Prigozhin was sort of congratulating Niger on its coup and calling it, an important sort of process of decolonization. And we know that the Wagner Group is certainly interested in finding new clients on the African continent that would provide it with money, funds in terms of extractive resources, and in exchange, it can deliver security assistance. And what we've seen in Mali is that there have been some efforts to sort of try to use Wagner for counterterrorism purposes, but there's also a sense that they're functioning as a kind of Praetorian Guard and really protecting the military regime instead of working to consolidate security in the parts of the country that are dealing with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State.
Who else does France and the West not want to have access to that uranium? Just about everybody else, but I mean, I guess where is their from their perspective, who is the greatest concern?
I don't want to. I don't want to sort of make any statements about that right now because I'm not too up to speed on the latest. I believe China is actually mining uranium, or at least has a contract to mine uranium, in northern Niger as well. As of a couple of years ago, I don't know where they're at with that now. They certainly wouldn't want it getting into Iranian hands, for example. There's an interesting observation. If you look at the last coup in Niger, which was in 2010, I believe, and it was another one of these sort of what gets called a democratizing coup because it ended up being pretty popular and toppled, a ruler who was about to help himself to an unconstitutional third term. And the people welcomed it, and it was largely bloodless or entirely bloodless. But at the time, what he was doing was giving out a lot of uranium licenses, to prospecting licenses to foreign countries. So, there's a lot of French officials like to really sort of downplay the extent to which France depends on, the currency, the West African currency, whose reserves are held in French banks, or uranium, which comes from northern Niger. But there's no question that these continue to represent significant strategic interests for France, and are seen as sort of a Western, sort of buttress against foreign rivals.
So ultimately, what is the interest of the U.S. and the West to actually support, or how sincere is their support, I guess I should say, for the ousted President Bazoum, and what is that founded on? I mean, it sounds like the coup was perpetrated by, someone who had been in there for at least someone who had been protecting the prior president. Is it so? How sincere is there? Are these protestations, and what are they hoping? What is the U.S. and the West interest genuinely in terms of the outcomes here?
They're very sincere. President Bazoum is considered, was seen really as the perfect kind of leader. He was someone, he came from an ethnic minority in his own country. He was someone who was able to, he was a very skilled politician. I'm speaking of him like he's dead. I mean, he's still alive. He might be returned to power. I think it's increasingly unlikely. But he made a reputation for himself as a very skilled politician, as a very skilled diplomat, someone who was able to juggle a lot of very difficult competing interests. And he was, especially as Mali and Burkina Faso kind of crumbled to repeated military coups and their security situations kept degenerating. And Wagner started to move in Mali and perhaps into Burkina Faso. It hasn't been confirmed yet. It became sort of more and more important that Niger was, for the West and was a strategic partner of the West. So we are going to see some fighting to sort of resist Niger going down a similar path as Mali and Burkina Faso. It's really seen as sort of the nail in the coffin for the Western effort to intervene to sort of stabilize the Sahel, which by many measures already is long dead and buried. But that has yet to be sort of acknowledged or navigated. In terms of strategic resources and assets, the U.S. has these bases in northern Niger that mean that it has a particular interest in continuing to have a relationship with Niger. So if you look at the wording, the U.S. has yet to call what's happened a coup. They're still trying to sort of negotiate for Bazoum and ideally put him back in place, which I think it's much too late for now. But the base really sort of figures into it. It's not an easy country for the U.S. to disengage from.
And just to be clear, they can't acknowledge it being a coup because then it becomes a real problem to maintain these relationships. So when you say fight,
financial,
maintain the financial relationship. So how do you anticipate, if you don't think that Bazoum is going to be brought back into power, would the West and the U.S. Be able to get around the idea of a coup if there was some third party installed? Like, what happens next?
So far, I mean, there are a few possible outcomes. We've seen efforts for mediation, one of which has been led by the United States. They've been going very poorly. The one from the West African regional body started out with a very aggressive deadline, threatening to send troops if Bazoum wasn't restored within a week. That did not go down well or succeed. The deadline has passed. Nothing's happened, apart from sanctions, which punish the population. And in some ways sort of consolidate support for the military rulers by posing an external threat. Possible outcomes, what's happened in Mali and Burkina Faso was that after the first coup, there was another coup. So, one possible outcome is once the sort of efforts to restore Bazoum, restore constitutional order, start to peter out. And also it bears keeping in mind that, the Sahel is really not a strategic priority globally for the United States. As important as the northern Niger base or bases may be, compared to Ukraine and the Middle East, it remains pretty low on the totem pole. And attention is scarce. So, I think what's likely, I think the junta is here to stay. There's a lot of popular support in the streets. We're seeing big pro-junta protests and various factions kind of lining up behind them. They just named a prime minister who's a sort of palatable technocrat with great relationships with European financial institutions. So I think we're going to see them sort of talk their way into legitimacy. And then it'll really be a question of how they navigate the problem of security partnerships. Because it's impossible to ally with Wagner and France and the US at the same time. So, we may see attention sort of wane, and once the threat of intervention or sanctions is sort of lifted, that may bring out internal dissent among the putschists and sort of more competition for power. Another thing we might see is movements in northern Niger from factions that maybe are loyal to Bazoum or are loyal to France, or don't like the direction that things are taking. The area of northern Niger has a history of rebellion, which hasn't happened in the past couple of decades, which is kind of remarkable. But it certainly sort of starts to become a prospect if the capital is taken over by military rulers. It may mean that certain regions will start to have other ideas about how they want to be ruled.
What do you make of some of the reporting I saw out of The Intercept from someone like Nick Turse that it was Nick's reporting that some of these military leaders had received U.S. military training, or some of the military operators that participated in the coup?
I mean, there's no question that that's true. And it's sort of a trope at this point. Whenever there's a coup, that it gets kind of reported on that the U.S. trains these figures and knows these figures. I don't think it says what Nick Turse and The Intercept are trying to suggest that it says. It's certainly not. These coups and this upheaval and this type of unrest is really not in the U.S. interest at all. I think it speaks more to flaws in U.S. strategies for engagement with this region, which are extremely sort of military-led, and the types of relationships and investments that American leaders keep making and maintaining and thinking will pay off don't seem to be paying off in the way that they would like. There's without a question.
We train everybody, it feels like. I mean, just to sort of like put our chips on, we're going to, it's like going to the roulette table, it feels like, and we're going to bet on every single bet there is. And usually that comes back to bite us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at not only the coups, but also the human rights track records of soldiers who've been trained by Western forces, it's grim stuff. I think what it really sort of calls for is a rethink of types of military partnerships and engagement on the continent. And in particular, this notion that counterterrorism, and counterinsurgency require these types of military interventions, which in the Sahel have created so many more problems than they wanted to solve in the first place.
Hannah Rae Armstrong, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.